nonprofit, and business sectors intersect and collaborate for the common good. This symposium is one of the hallmarks of achieving that vision. Today, we hope to inspire you to think differently about how all of us working together can address the income gap through creation of jobs that pay living wages and rebuild the middle class. First, I want to thank all of our speakers and panelists. Next, I have a special thank you to Dr. Chris Norman Major, faculty member extraordinaire, who, by the way, is here even though she would prefer to be home because she's a little under the weather. So thank you, Chris. She has led the planning and coordination of the event, along with a steering committee consisting of Craig Waldron, Jim Scheibel, Glenn Ford, and Cynthia Johnson. So thank you for all your hard work. In addition, I want to thank our sponsors for the day, the Minnesota Economic Development Foundation, the Metropolitan Council, the Dakota Electric Association, and the Minnesota Building and Construction Trades Council. This day was made possible by the support from all of you. We only need to look at recent events in the news to see what a critical need this symposium fulfills. Yesterday, in announcing his candidacy for presidency, Senator Bernie Sanders said, "How does it happen that the top 1% own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%? In Baltimore this past week, we witnessed both violence that harmed neighborhoods, as well as neighbors helping other neighbors recover and continue the conversation in a peaceful way. This is a complicated, complex subject that requires human and system solutions. What we talk about today can help continue the journey to remedying the disparities that confront us all. Throughout the day, we have the privilege of hearing from and interacting with leaders from all three sectors who make a difference in this area. This morning, we start with a keynote from J.R. Burke, followed by the CED talks, which we have modeled after the TED Talks to be informative and thought-provoking. Over lunch, Hedrick Smith will talk about a multi-sector approach to the key issues in reducing inequality. Then we will transition to the afternoon breakout sessions. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the day, Mr. J.R. Burke. A native Minnesotan, J.R. has a law degree and Master's of Public Administration degree from Hamline University, as well as a Bachelor in Political Science from St. Cloud State. No, a good institution too. Go Huskies. J.R.'s and Pipers. J.R. started his career working for Congressman Bill Luther as Deputy Press Secretary. Next, he joined the City of St. Paul as a Homeland Security consultant, and then went on to Harrington Company as Director of Government Affairs. Currently, he is the Manager of State and Provincial Government Relations at Polaris Industries. Please welcome J.R.
Well, thank you, Dean McCarthy, and certainly Chris Norman Major. I want to say a special thanks to her as well as we get my presentation up and going here. Check. Well, again, thank you to Dean McCarthy and Hamline University. I'm definitely a proud alum. And just by way of quick background, I am a born and bred native Minnesotan, and I work for a quintessentially Minnesotan company. Polaris Industries has been around since 1954, so we just celebrated our 60-year anniversary last year. Started in Roseville, Minnesota. Still is our flagship manufacturing plant here in North America. And, you know, I'm conflicted to a certain degree on it because this is such a complicated subject matter. And I represent a business. We live, work, and play in communities. Our employees are incredibly important to us. Our customers are incredibly important to us. Our partners are incredibly important to us. They come from all walks of life. They come from all backgrounds and different types of communities here in the metro area, greater Minnesota, and we certainly see a lot of these debates playing out at the Capitol. Some of the tension that is there with policymakers, Do we invest more in the metro area? Do we invest more in greater Minnesota? Do we have to look at it from an efficiency perspective, an economic perspective? You know, how sustainable are some of these communities in greater Minnesota? And that's one of the things that Polaris struggles with every day, is continuing to figure out ways to think creatively so that we can meet our labor demands, which are driven by customer demand. So this is a very complicated and complex subject matter area. But I have to say, you know, state and provincial government relations, it's a pretty broad swath of responsibility. I travel a lot, to the chagrin of my wife and my kids, but you know, I see a lot of different places, I talk to a lot of different people, and I have to tell you that there is something about this place, there is something about Minnesota. Number one, it's our optimism. We really do have a lot of creative minds here. We have a lot of people who have, you know, a say-do attitude. If you say something, you do it. We have a lot of people who care deeply about the community, which is Minnesota. It's not just the seven-county metro area, but we really, I mean, I would suggest that the majority of you have some ties out to greater Minnesota. You know, whether it's you came from greater Minnesota, your parents are from greater Minnesota, your grandparents came from greater Minnesota, but we all come from this broader community. It's not just, this issue is not just unique to the metro area. So I really look at it as a very holistic perspective, and I work with members across the aisle. Some of our biggest champions are Senate Democrats. Some of our biggest champions are House Republicans. So, and they work collaboratively on this issue. It really is quite amazing how collaboratively they work on some of these issues. So I want to kind of lay that foundation. So, you know, I was at the Capitol a couple days ago, and I got handed this. And this is this comes from DEED. And it was a discussion on the demographic trends and projections of our labor force to the Minnesota House of Representatives. And one of the things that they shared is that projected job growth and projected labor force growth, there's going to be some conflict coming up. And I think...
Thank you for tap dancing. I apologize for interrupting.
Hey, I am the... I try to be as low maintenance as possible. I promise you that. So... So one of the things that they shared was that you know, we're going to soon have more jobs than we have workers in Minnesota. And what they're saying is that they're projecting that the crossover is going to be in 2017. Well, I would suggest that the crossover has already occurred in some parts of our state. Roseau is definitely one of those areas. We have declining enrollment in the Roseau School District for the first time in its history this year. That's a troubling trend for a company like Polaris, who works really closely with the schools to make sure that there are, kids who don't feel like they have to leave their home community in order to find a job. Polaris has been around for 60 years, so you know, we've got a good track record in the community. You drive into that community, and our name is on the water tower. You go into the grocery store, and there's murals across the top of the grocery store showing all of our products from, you know, decades ago. So we really do have a tie in the community. So to see declining enrollment at the Roseau School District is a really troubling trend for us, especially with the majority of the workers at the Roseau plant not requiring some sort of advanced degree, but a high school diploma. And then I'll talk about some of the wage issues and some of the ways in which we try to encourage folks to stay here shortly. But I think it really is a really troubling trend to see what I refer to Polaris as a quintessential Minnesota company. It's interesting that, I'm not going to speak for everybody here, but I suspect that many of you have heard of Polaris before today. And what we have found is that even though Polaris isn't the largest company in Minnesota, we have a lot of great companies here. We have a virtually universal name recognition here in this state. akin to 3M and Target and so on and so forth. So we're really blessed that we have such a strong heritage here. And so when we look at Roseau, we almost take it personal to see some of the troubles that this community finds itself in. And that's why, you know, as we look at, you know, where do we grow and, you know, where do we make investments to continue ensuring that Polaris can remain a profitable company, we do take significant strides to make sure that Roseau is a significant part of that discussion. The other thing from this deed report, which I found really interesting, was, and I think this was in the news recently, is the migration of our people and how we're projecting a negative migration. So the number of people that are leaving Minnesota, by and large, they're students. They're people who are entering their college years, are not being backfilled at the pace that they're leaving. And it's hard to say how long that will last, but it's interesting that you know, we focus on what strong academic institutions we have. We're very diverse. We bring in a lot of folks from outside of Minnesota, but also outside of the country. So we have a lot of international students that come in and they decide to stay. They decide to work for companies like Polaris. Polaris itself is a very diverse company. You walk around our R&D facility, some of our finest engineers aren't from here. Some of the finest engineers we have, though, are also farm kids, you know, kids that grew up tinkering, and they found their niche, and Polaris is it. So the reason I bring up the international migration is there are costs to that for a business like Polaris, making sure that they can continue to work here once they graduate. Costs us money to make sure that they get integrated into the community. We also run into challenges with turnover because we, you know, are they here alone? Do they want to bring their family down the road? Do they get homesick? Do they decide to go home? And I think that even the universities, even when I was here at Hamline, I remember having discussions about whether or not international students come here, they learn in some of the greatest institutions in the world, and then they take the things that they learn and then bring them back to their home countries. So there are challenges that we face as an organization, as a state, in relying on international migrants coming in to backfill the outflow of domestic citizens. So I think we should be mindful of that too. So let's see if we can liven this up a little bit. Or not. Well, I'm going to show that to you eventually. I'm going to tell you that because because it's probably the most interesting part of my presentation, to be quite honest with you. So the other thing I just needed to mention is I don't see any wild jerseys. It's Casual Friday, people. So I'm trying to grow my playoff beard out a little bit, and I don't see too many of those either. But and I see a couple that have me beat. So I bring that up. So the Polaris experience, as we call it, is, like I said, 60 years old. And it started out with 3 people, 2 brothers and their friend David Johnston. So what they did was they started out as Hatteen, Hoyce, and Derrick. They were a small ag company. They were tinkerers themselves from greater Minnesota. And they created the Snow Traveler, which was the first snowmobile. And what happened was Alan and Edgar, brothers, they always had this creative tension with one another. And when they created the first snowmobile, Edgar thought, and Edgar was just this character, right? He looked like a guy out of the 1940s and 1950s film era, you know, real bristly and broad at the shoulders, and just he could climb mountains. So he decided to take this snowmobile, similar to the one you see here, and he had the nerve to drive it across Alaska. Thought that was a good idea. So his brother Alan on the left and David on the far right thought, yeah, this isn't such a great idea. Not only for your safety, but we got a new business we're trying to get off the ground here. But he did it anyways, and it took him a long time, and he spent a lot of money doing it. And so what happened was, from those humble beginnings, they created something great. So what we have here is a chart, and I'll talk through this real quickly. Polaris started with 3. So when the guy in the middle gets back, they had a pretty small board of directors at the time. David and Alan said, hey, that was a dumb idea. So Edgar, you have to forgive me, I work at Polaris, pretty much gave him the middle finger and decided to move an hour and 15 minutes away and create Articat, who is one of our biggest competitors today. How ironic. So he moves an hour and 15 minutes away, and you can see him here. This is Edgar. He then goes on to create ASV, which is a land moving company. And today, out of those companies, in Minnesota, there are over 6,000 jobs that really started in 1954 with 3 folks who, again, they were tinkerers. They were just regular Joes. In fact, David Johnson, he's the only one who's still with us, would say that back in 1954, there were days that he wished that he had showed up to work and that the doors would be locked because it was so difficult to kind of keep cash flow going and keep the vision going, that it was a very difficult time. And I think that a lot of us, we have discussions with folks in our community, we run into similar conversations. But today, Polaris is a thriving company, but we don't do it alone. We have over 115 suppliers that we use right here in Minnesota. Minnesota is the source of our largest base of suppliers, and they themselves are job creators here in Minnesota. So we really couldn't do it without them. But they also face a lot of the challenges that we face with labor shortages, housing shortages. How do we get people to and from work efficiently? How do we keep morale up, in turbulent times that we've just come out of? And then we have dealers. And our dealers are independently owned, but we touch all corners of the state. So I bring this up by way of saying that this is really a nonpartisan issue for me, even though it has some very partisan slants. 70%, I've been told by Tom Bach himself, 70% of his constituents own Polaris products. So I don't know if that's true or not. But if they own a PowerSports product, I'm more than happy. And he's been a great friend to us, as has the speaker, been a great friend to us and Polaris. The governor, who I wish were here, I'd certainly send him a thank you. They've all been very, very beneficial as Polaris and other companies and even just our communities try to find creative ways to address things around housing, transportation, labor, and so on and so forth. So let me tell you how Polaris has really grown in the last couple of years, and then I'll get into the impact it has on our workforce. So we just came out of a recession not too long ago, and we really led an innovation, and we always have. And the reason we do that is because we've spent a significant amount of our revenue on R&D. And we did that even during the height of the recession. And so in 2010, when we were introducing, this is just a snapshot of some of the products we introduced. We introduced dozens of new products in 2010. Our competitors, which include Honda, Harley-Davidson, other household names, didn't introduce any. And so we took a bet that we could come out of this recession stronger than we went into it. And we were betting on not only our brand, but our people, and the results you can see there, are pretty significant. So we had significant growth in from 2010 through 2014, and we're projecting 9 to 12% growth this year as of our earnings call last week with investors. So we feel we've got our foot on the gas, I guess is my point. And here's the result. So this is our North American Power Sports consolidated share. So you see household names, as I mentioned, Honda, Harley, Yamaha, and Polaris surpasses them all by quite a distance. And we're very, very proud of that. This is probably the slide that I see most internally and externally when we talk to investors and owners. So let me transition to Polaris and how we relate back to Minnesota. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, Polaris is a great place to live, work, and play. We've got high rankings from some respected sources like Forbes and CNBC. We've got some of the best companies in the world here. I work with a lot of their government relations folks, and they all have great, great stories to tell. They all have great, great cultures, and it's all really based off of a Minnesota background. Great healthcare, great outdoors, great metro area, great institutions of higher learning, including this one. Sorry, I suppose I should have put Hamline up there. I didn't create this slide. But these really are the things that not just Polaris touts every day, but our policymakers tout, our institutions tout when you try and recruit folks to come in to your enrollment numbers. So I then shift to what are some of the challenges. As I alluded to earlier, these are from the Minnesota State Demographer, and it shows a domestic migration out of Minnesotans, which I find troubling. And at the bottom, I really liked this visual. The average of 101,000 people move to Minnesota each year, with 113,000 moving out. So I think from Polaris, there's a couple of impacts to that I'll allude to now, and I'll talk to in more specificity shortly. But I would suggest that causes an increase in cost to doing business in Minnesota, because we need to attract talent through compensation, instead of Minnesota just attracting talent just kind of from a comprehensive perspective. So then the burden gets shifted to employers to figure out, if we want to continue to do operations in Minnesota, how do we attract talent here? Because we need people to produce the goods that go out to the market. So we have some challenges here, and I really don't view this as so much a partisan issue as a challenge to us all, whether we're in the metro area or in greater Minnesota. How do we ensure that Minnesota continues to have the brand that it's always relied on to continue to attract new folks to come into our labor market and contribute to our communities? So what are the challenges? Briefly, in Minnesota, according again to the state demographer, only 6% increase in younger than 18-year-olds from 2010 to 2035. So who are going to be our students that graduate from college or graduate from high school? Who are we going to pull from if we have 6% increase? I mentioned that we're projected to grow 9 to 12% in revenue this year. Our revenue is directly tied to consumer demand. Consumer demand directly ties back to how many people we need to create our products. So if we don't have the workforce, if we're only growing at 6% of young people, and then we know that we're losing a lot of them who are going out of state to get education, they're not coming back, we find ourselves in a bit of a conundrum there. Since 2001, domestic net losses of approximately 7,000 to 12,000 people a year. You see the age breakdowns of those losses of domestic migration. And then the new labor participants, this is probably the most striking numbers for me. In the 90s, we had 40,000 new labor participants annually, and going forward, we're looking at about 10% of that. I just can't see a scenario where that's good. Certainly not for a company like Polaris, particularly when we're facing challenges now in Roseau. You know, how do we, if we're talking about flight from rural communities to the metro areas, we have not as many kids who are growing up. We don't have skilled trades programs in our schools anymore. Those are quickly going away. We've got parents who believe that the only way that their child can be successful in life is if they receive some sort of advanced degree. You know, for Polaris, I mean, location certainly is one of those big issues for us, right? We're only a stone's throw from Canada. We've got weather challenges, as you know. Proximity to services. In fact, it's interesting, not that Walmart's particularly popular in many areas, but the nearest Walmart to Roseau is an hour and 15 minutes away. Same for McDonald's. So we do have a Subway, though. So, you know, it is. I mean, it's one of those challenges where you can't just pop out to a Starbucks for a cup of coffee in the morning. You can't just run over to the mall or the Target to, you know, pick up some groceries and paper towels. So, again, for Polaris, we also run into a baby boomer problem. So, the next 10 years, 500 of our workers will be retirement eligible. So that's about a quarter of our workforce in Roseau. So that's a big challenge. As I mentioned, declining enrollment in Roseau School District, the lack of skilled trades programs, not only at the K through 12 system, but also at the MnSCU system. And I've been working with MnSCU to try and figure out how can we develop some programs to align skilled trades programs, welding, machining, so on and so forth, so that we can push these out to greater Minnesota. And, you know, they have the Bemidji campus, they have what's called a 360 program, and they're really trying to be creative about how they do that. So we're going to try and take advantage of those, and we've encouraged some of our, even some of our competitors like Articat to take advantage of the same thing. But we run into also regional competition concerns. You know, it's not a doomsday scenario for Polaris by any means, but it is a big challenge. And one of the challenges to the benefit of Minnesota is that Northwest Minnesota is actually pretty competitive. Marvin Windows, everyone's heard of Marvin Windows. Articat, of course, DigiKey, you know. These are really successful Minnesota businesses that are out in the middle of nowhere, you know. So the other challenge we run into is that, you know, even though we're competitive, and you would think, gosh, you know, is Roseau anywhere, is it very unlike, let's say, Grand Rapids, Minnesota, or Brainerd, or, you know, name it, in greater Minnesota? Can't you pull from there? Well, we lose a lot of our kids to the Bakken. That's slowed, certainly. But the Bakken plays a role. The mines have played a role. And again, that's slowed to a certain degree. If you've seen the U.S. Steel and Mintac have had their challenges. But what we have found is that even when there's a layoff and they get unemployment, workers get unemployment, they wait. They try and ride it out. They try and ride out the layoff. It's going to be temporary. I've got unemployment. I'm already in a community. I've got housing, something that we struggle with in Roseau. Where do we put our people when they come? I've got family ties, so it's really difficult to say, you know, even though you'd say, you know, what are the great things about Roseau? Well, hunting, fishing, the outdoors, camping, high school sports, go Rams. You know, can't you pull from other parts of the state? Well, it's really tough. It really is. Even when there's a lot of similarities, you know, these kids coming from greater Minnesota, just take them to another part of greater Minnesota, it's a challenge. And frankly, some of the wages that these kids are getting from the mines, from the plants, you know, the steel plants and things like that, they're pretty competitive. So it can be a real challenge to attract from other communities as I mentioned, we're not alone. So this is really a Minnesota-wide issue, and you'll see that when I talk about some of the legislation that's been introduced by the legislature and the folks who have done the introducing. So AGCO, which is an agriculture company in southwestern Minnesota, they have a huge plant. They've got some huge issues in workforce down there themselves. But the ones, Schwann's, of course, everyone's heard of. Also, Alan Poff, a good friend of mine, is their government relations person down there. We banter back and forth about, he's in the south of Congressman Colin Peterson's district. I'm in the north, and we're always going back and forth with Colin about, who you gonna help more. But Central Boiler, which is a smaller company, but also a growing company in northwest Minnesota, they're attracting talent away from Polaris. Arcticat, same thing. DigiKey, same thing. So what does that do to us? Well, we have to be more competitive on wages. The more competitive we are on wages, and it's not that we don't want to pay our people a good wage, and you'll see that we do, but it just costs up the costs of doing business in Roseau, and that can be a bit of a challenge. So in terms of how we view, if you want to say the profitability of our plant, it's about being right-sized. So as you can see, we are, it's not perfect, but pretty close to a precise response to economic conditions, slight downturn during the recession in headcount to production, but pretty consistent. We try to maintain our staffing levels to what our consumers demand. And interestingly enough, you would think you would see a much deeper dip during the recession because look at the products that we produce. ATVs, snowmobiles, motorcycles. Do you need those to get to work? No. Did the majority of Americans have the discretionary income to put gas in those things to go and operate them on the weekends or, get out of town or go to a resort, things like that? No. So we had to be really creative too about how we kept, the wheels turning of innovation, how we kept our consumers interested in our products, and we did a really, really good job. So we're very proud of our record at Polaris about how we were able to make that happen. Now I'll have to say that a lot of it has been a diversification strategy.